The morning I drove to the lake house, the radio was playing a quiet song sung by a woman whose name I didn't recognize. I liked the sound anyway. The windows were down, and although September had begun to bring a chill to the air, the warmth of the late summer still lingered. I had been looking forward to the weekend for months. The plan was simple. 3 quiet days by the lake, a stack of library books, coffee on the dock, and no one asking anything of me. After years of working, raising children, managing a household, and handling responsibilities that seemed to multiply with age, I had learned to treasure silence. The lake house was supposed to be my place of peace. I turned from the county highway onto the familiar gravel road. I had driven that road so many times that I knew every bend by instinct. The birch trees along the shoulders had begun turning yellow at their tips, and sunlight flickered through the branches. Then I rounded the final curve. 4 unfamiliar vehicles were scattered across my lawn. A pickup truck sat near the garage. A silver sedan was parked beside it, with a child's car seat visible through the rear window. A convertible occupied part of the grass, its top down, and a beach towel hanging over one seat. And my son's Jeep was parked directly beside the porch. I slowed down. For several seconds, I simply sat behind the wheel. The house was clearly occupied. Voices drifted through the screen door. A television played loudly inside, followed by the unmistakable shrieks and laughter of children. I switched off the engine. My eyes moved toward the lake. The dock my late husband had built stood beyond the yard. He had spent an entire summer constructing it 31 years earlier. After working his shifts at the plant, he would come home, change clothes, and head straight down to the water. I used to bring him iced tea and sit nearby while he worked. After he died, I had maintained that dock myself. I replaced boards, tightened hardware, restained the wood every few years. It wasn't merely a structure. It carried pieces of our life. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch. Before I reached the stairs, my daughter-in-law, Sabrina, came through the screen door. She wore a sundress I had never seen before and held a red plastic cup in one hand. She stopped when she saw me. Instead of greeting me, she frowned. "What are you doing here?" I stared at her. "This is my house," I said calmly. "I came for the weekend." Her expression hardened. "We're using it this weekend." I glanced toward the house. "You didn't tell me. You should have called." I almost laughed. "My name is on the deed, Sabrina. I shouldn't have to make an appointment to enter my own property." She tilted her head, then glanced over her shoulder. Someone's grandmother showed up uninvited again. Laughter erupted from inside. It wasn't nervous laughter. It was amused laughter at my expense. I felt something inside me go completely still. My son, Julian, appeared in the doorway. He looked at me, then he looked at Sabrina. Finally, his eyes dropped toward the porch floor. "Mom," I waited. I expected him to say something else. "I'm sorry. This isn't right. Let me fix this." Instead, he shifted his weight. "It's just for the weekend. We didn't think you'd be coming." I looked at my son. "I didn't realize I needed permission to come here." Sabrina folded her arms. "There isn't even a bedroom available. We've got people everywhere." I looked from her to Julian, then I nodded. "Okay." I turned around. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I walked back to my car. About a mile down the road, I pulled onto the shoulder. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but my breathing wasn't. I sat there for several minutes. Then I opened the notes app on my phone. I began writing everything down: the time I arrived, the vehicles, the people, the exact words Sabrina had used, the laughter, every detail I could remember. I drove back slowly and parked where the trees concealed me from the house. From there, I photographed the vehicles and recorded their license plates. I noticed several kayaks had been dragged from the shed and left upside down across the lawn. The shed door was open. Its latch appeared bent. I was still studying it when my neighbor, Gideon Hale, appeared at the end of his driveway. He walked toward me. "I figured you'd want to know," he said quietly. "They've been there since yesterday." I lowered my phone. "Yesterday?" He nodded. "People coming and going all afternoon. Last night, somebody was setting off fireworks near the dock." I stared toward the lake. "Near my dock? That's where they were." He paused. "I almost called someone. You should have." He gave me a sympathetic look. "You're welcome to stay at my place tonight." I thanked him, but I already knew what I needed to do. I drove into town and checked into a small motel. That evening, sitting alone in the quiet room, I opened my notes again. I read everything I had written, then I added one final sentence. Something about this wasn't right. I didn't know yet how serious it was, but I intended to find out. I barely slept that night. Not because of the confrontation with Sabrina, though I replayed that scene more times than I wanted to admit. What kept me awake was the house itself. Something had changed. It wasn't simply that my son and his wife had invited people without telling me. It wasn't even the disrespect of being laughed at on my own porch. It was the condition of the property, the bent shed latch, the kayaks scattered across the lawn, the fireworks near the dock. Those things suggested carelessness. But carelessness was different from something deliberate. I woke before 7 the next morning, dressed, and drove back to the lake house. The property was quiet. Most of the vehicles were still there, but the house had none of the previous night's energy. I parked along the road rather than in the driveway. When I approached the porch, Sabrina's younger sister answered the door. She looked surprised to see me. Unlike Sabrina, she didn't seem angry. She simply stepped aside. I walked in. The disorder was worse than I had expected. Cups and plates covered the kitchen counters. Clothing was piled over furniture. Children's toys were scattered across the hallway. Someone had left food, sitting uncovered on the dining table. My reading chair had a stranger's jacket thrown across it. I said nothing. I went directly to the bathroom and retrieved my medication. Then I walked upstairs. I had another reason for being there. 6 weeks earlier, I had placed an envelope in the drawer of the nightstand in the main bedroom. Inside were copies of important property and estate documents, along with a handwritten letter my father had written to me many years ago. The letter wasn't legally important. To me, it was priceless. I had planned to move everything into my fireproof box at home. I simply hadn't gotten around to it. I opened the bedroom door. My belongings had been moved. Not packed carefully, swept aside. The top of the dresser was covered with a messy pile of my personal things. I opened the nightstand drawer. Empty. I checked it again. Nothing. I searched the second drawer. Nothing. Then I checked beneath the bed, the closet, and even between the mattress and box spring. The envelope was gone. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the empty drawer. That was when my feelings changed. The humiliation from the day before disappeared. In its place came something colder. Someone had gone through my belongings. Someone had found the envelope. And someone had removed it. I took photographs of everything, the drawer, the dresser, the closet, the condition of the room. I didn't confront Sabrina. I didn't confront her sister. I simply walked downstairs, thanked the young woman for allowing me inside, and left. Then I drove straight to Gideon's house. He was working in his garden. When he saw me, he wiped his hands on his trousers and came over. I told him what had happened. He listened carefully. When I finished, he disappeared into his house. A moment later, he returned with a business card. "My brother-in-law's daughter is an attorney," he said. "She handles property law." I looked at the card, Wren Calloway. I called her from Gideon's kitchen. She asked me to come to her office that afternoon. I arrived with my photographs and notes. Wren was younger than I had expected, perhaps in her late 30s. She wore reading glasses on top of her head and listened without interrupting while I explained everything. When I finished, she studied the photographs. "The missing envelope concerns me," she said. "It was only copies." "Even so, someone removed your property without permission." She explained that the actual deed was recorded with the county, meaning nobody could simply steal my copy and take ownership of the property. That was reassuring, but it didn't make the missing documents harmless. "What should I do?" I asked. "Document everything," she said, "and we should report the missing materials." I nodded. Then she asked, "Is there anything else missing?" I thought about the house. At first, nothing came to mind. Then I remembered the small cedar box on the bedroom dresser. "My husband's watch." Wren looked up. "What kind of watch?" "An old one. He wore it almost every day of his adult life. Was it there recently?" "Yes." "Then check." We returned to the lake house together. This time we were accompanied by Deputy Marcus Bell. When Sabrina opened the door and saw the deputy, something flashed across her face. Alarm, it disappeared quickly. Marcus explained that there had been a complaint concerning property removed from the home and that he needed to verify the situation. Sabrina immediately began explaining. She said she had permission to use the house. She said I had always treated the property as a family place. She said there had been a misunderstanding. Marcus listened patiently. Then he asked one question. Is Clara Bennett permitted to enter her own property? Sabrina hesitated. Yes, then we'll proceed. We went upstairs. I walked to the dressers. The cedar box was still there. I opened it, empty. My husband's watch was gone. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Sabrina said quietly, he probably moved it somewhere for safekeeping. Marcus looked at her. Who? She didn't answer. My son wasn't there. I closed the cedar box. I didn't cry. Not then. I simply stood there and understood that this had become something far more serious than a ruined weekend. Someone had crossed a line, and I was finally ready to stop pretending they hadn't. Deputy Marcus Bell completed his report before we left the bedroom. He asked me several questions, writing down my answers without adding commentary. When had I last seen the watch? Where had I kept it? Who had access to the house? Had I given anyone permission to remove my belongings? My answers were simple, no, and absolutely not. Ren remained beside me, quietly observing everything. Downstairs, Sabrina was still trying to explain the situation. She said she hadn't taken anything. She said people had moved things around. She said perhaps Julian had handled the watch. I listened from the staircase. There was something strangely comforting about hearing her explanations become less convincing with every sentence. For months, I had wondered whether I was imagining the distance between my son and me. Now I understood that I wasn't. Julian had allowed this to happen. Maybe he hadn't planned it. Maybe he hadn't understood everything Sabrina intended. But he had known she was bringing people to the house. He had known I hadn't been invited. And when I arrived, he had stood in that doorway and watched me leave. That was enough. Ren spoke with Marcus outside. I remained near the dock. The water was calm that afternoon. A loon drifted across the lake, barely moving. My husband had loved loons. He used to tell me he could recognize individual birds by their calls. I never knew whether that was true, but I always enjoyed listening to him explain it. I thought about him then, about the summer he built the dock, about how carefully he measured every board, about how annoyed he became when something didn't fit correctly. He had always believed that things worth keeping required maintenance. Maybe marriages did too. Maybe families did. But maintenance couldn't repair something if only one person cared enough to keep trying. I returned to the motel. That evening, my phone began ringing. Julian. I watched his name appear on the screen, then disappear. A few minutes later, he called again and again. By the 7th call, I answered. Mom. His voice sounded tired. You didn't have to do all this. I stared through the motel window. Do what? You brought a deputy to the house. I reported missing property. It wasn't like that. I closed my eyes. The watch is missing. Silence. Then he said, I didn't know about the watch. I believed him. That was the worst part. I believe you, I said. Then why are you doing this? Because believing you doesn't mean I should ignore what happened. He sighed. We were only using the house for the weekend. You were using my house without asking me. We thought you'd be okay with it. No. You thought I'd accept it. He didn't respond, I continued. There's a difference. Another silence, then Julian said, Sabrina didn't mean anything by what she said. I remembered standing at the bottom of the porch steps. The laughter, the words. She called me somebody's grandmother. She was joking. It wasn't funny. I know. His voice became quieter. I know, Mom. For the first time, I heard regret, but regret wasn't the same as responsibility. I told him I wasn't ready to discuss anything else. Then I ended the call. The following week became surprisingly orderly. Ren filed the necessary paperwork to protect my rights to the property and begin formal trespass proceedings. Marcus kept the report open regarding the missing belongings. The guests who had been staying at the house left quickly once they learned there was a property dispute. I didn't blame them. They had apparently believed they were visiting a family vacation home. They hadn't known the truth. Sabrina left the next morning after the order was served. She carried a bag over one shoulder and walked toward her car without looking at me. For a moment, I wondered whether she would say something, an apology, an explanation, anything. She didn't. The car disappeared down the road. And suddenly the house became quiet, not peaceful yet, just quiet. I walked through every room, I opened windows, collected abandoned cups, folded blankets, moved furniture back into place. I found a child's toy beneath the sofa and placed it in a box near the front door. Then I went upstairs. The bedroom still looked disturbed. I didn't try to fix it immediately. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time since arriving, I allowed myself to cry, not because Sabrina had insulted me, not because strangers had taken over the house. I cried because my son had stood there and watched it happen. That hurt more than anything else. 2 days later, Julian came to the lake house alone. I was sitting on the dock when I heard his footsteps. He stopped several feet behind me. "Mom," I turned. He looked older than he had a week earlier. Maybe I did too. He came down and sat in the chair beside mine. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry." I waited, he continued. I knew Sabrina was planning the weekend. I didn't ask enough questions. I told myself it was harmless. I looked at him. "Why?" He rubbed his hands together. "Because I didn't want another argument with her." That answer was painful, but it was honest. I nodded slowly. At least now I know the truth. He looked towards the water. "Is there anything I can do?" I thought about that question. There were many things he could do, but none of them could erase what had already happened. So I answered carefully. "Start by understanding that being silent isn't the same as staying out of something." He looked at me. "You think I failed you. I think you failed to protect something that mattered to me." He lowered his eyes. I wasn't ready to forgive him, but for the first time, I believed forgiveness might someday be possible. Julian stayed beside me on the dock for nearly an hour. We talked about small things at first. The weather, the condition of the road, the repairs the house would need before winter. Neither of us mentioned Sabrina. Eventually, Julian stood. I should go. I nodded. Before he left, he turned toward me. "Mom, I'm sorry." This time, I believed he meant it, but I also knew an apology couldn't be the end of the story. After he drove away, I returned inside and began restoring the house. I washed dishes, collected trash, folded blankets, put furniture back where it belonged. The work was strangely calming. There was something reassuring about returning objects to their proper places. A chair belonged beside the window. Books belonged on shelves. The dishes belonged in cabinets. The house slowly began to look like itself again, but there were still things I couldn't replace: the missing envelope, the watch, the trust. A week passed, then another. Ren called regularly and kept me informed about the legal paperwork. The trespass order remained in effect, and Sabrina had no permission to return without my approval. I was grateful for Ren's calm approach. She never encouraged me to act out of anger. "Let the facts speak," she told me, so I did. I kept every document, every photograph, every message, every report. I wrote down dates and times. I had spent 28 years working in a medical office where records mattered. A missing signature could cause a problem. A wrong date could create confusion. Documentation had always been part of my life. Now it became my protection. One afternoon, Ren called. "We have an update." I sat at my kitchen table. "What kind?" "The watch." My heart immediately tightened. Did they find it? Not exactly. Sabrina's sister contacted me. I waited. She says she found it among her belongings. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Where was it? She says it had been placed inside a bag after the weekend. She claims she didn't realize it was there. I didn't know whether to believe her. But the watch was coming back. That was what mattered. 3 days later, Sabrina's sister drove to the lake house. I watched her car pull into the driveway. She stepped out, carrying a small cedar box. She walked to the porch and knocked. I opened the door. She held the box toward me. "I'm sorry." Her voice trembled. I honestly didn't know it was in my things. I took the box. Inside was my husband's watch. I picked it up carefully. The familiar weight settled into my palm. For a moment, I was transported backward through time. My husband standing at the kitchen counter. his sleeves rolled up. That watch fastened around his wrist. The way he would glance at it before leaving for work. 30 years of ordinary moments suddenly seemed to live inside that small piece of metal. I looked at the young woman standing on my porch. I believe you didn't know. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Thank you. I nodded. I didn't invite her inside, not because I hated her, because I wasn't ready. There is a difference. She left a few minutes later. I carried the watch inside. Then I placed it back into the cedar box. For the first time in weeks, something felt returned to where it belonged, but the experience had changed me. I no longer assumed that family meant unlimited access. I no longer believed that kindness required me to ignore disrespect, and I no longer confused keeping peace with having peace. Those were different things. One evening, Julian called again. How are you? I'm getting better. I heard the watch came back. It did. I'm glad. There was a long pause. Then he said, I should have stopped things sooner. Yes. He breathed out slowly. I don't know what happens now. Neither do I. He was quiet. Then he said, I don't want to lose you. I looked toward the window. Outside, the last light was fading over the lake. You won't lose me because I set boundaries, I said. You'll lose me if you refuse to respect them. I understand. I hoped he did. But understanding isn't something you can prove with words. It is proved through choices. After we hung up, I walked outside. The dock stretched toward the darkening water. I ran my hand along one of the boards my husband had installed decades earlier. The wood was weathered now. Some boards had been replaced. Others remained original. That was the nature of things that lasted. They weren't preserved perfectly. They were repaired, maintained, protected. I realized that perhaps family worked the same way. You couldn't prevent damage. You couldn't control another person's choices. But you could decide what you were willing to repair, and what you were finally willing to leave behind. That night, I placed my husband's watch in the cedar box. Then I locked the box. The next morning, I drove into town and bought a new lock for the shed. I also bought a small lockbox for the spare house key. I installed it myself. It wasn't dramatic, no confrontation, no angry speech, just a simple change. A quiet declaration that access to my home would now be something I controlled. When Gideon saw it, he nodded. Good idea. I should have done it years ago. He smiled. Most people don't install locks until they learn why they need them. I looked toward the lake. Lesson learned. And this time I meant it. By November, the lake house had become quiet again. The leaves had fallen from the birches, leaving their branches bare against the pale sky. The air was colder now, and the mornings carried a thin layer of frost across the grass. I found that I liked the house better that way. There were no unfamiliar cars in the driveway, no loud music, no strangers leaving cups on the porch, no children running across the lawn. Only wind, water, and the occasional call of a bird somewhere beyond the trees. Gideon stopped by often. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes he brought nothing at all. We had reached the stage of friendship where conversation wasn't required. One morning, while I was repairing the shed latch, he stood nearby holding his coffee. You sure you don't want me to do that? I've got it. He smiled. I know. I tightened the final screw. The new latch held firmly. I tested it twice, then I stepped back. There, Gideon nodded. Better. I walked toward the porch. He followed. I've known you for more than 20 years, he said. I looked at him. That's a long time. It is. He took a sip of coffee. I've been thinking about what happened. So have I. You handled it better than most people would. I laughed quietly. I didn't always feel like I was handling it well. Wanting to make a scene isn't the same as making one. I smiled. He was right. There had been moments when I wanted to shout. I wanted Sabrina to understand exactly how much she had hurt me. I wanted Julian to feel the same humiliation I had felt standing on that porch. I wanted everyone who had laughed that afternoon to understand that they had been laughing at the wrong person. But I hadn't done those things. Instead, I had documented what happened. I had asked for help. I had protected my property. I had allowed the consequences to speak for themselves. That realization mattered more to me than I expected. I had spent years believing that being strong meant enduring things quietly. I no longer believed that. Strength wasn't silence. It was knowing when silence had stopped serving you. My relationship with Julian remained uncertain. He called regularly. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. He told me little pieces of what was happening in his marriage. I listened. But I didn't tell him what decision to make. That wasn't my place. I had spent enough time trying to solve problems that belonged to other people. If his marriage survived, they would have to rebuild it themselves. If it ended, that would also be their responsibility. I could be his mother without becoming his rescuer. That distinction took me a long time to understand. One Saturday morning, Julian came to the lake house again. He helped me carry several boxes from the garage. When we finished, he stood beside the porch. "Mom? Yes? Do you still want me here?" I looked at him. Of course. His eyes became wet. "I thought maybe you didn't. I was angry with you. I know. But anger isn't the same as not loving someone." He nodded, then he hugged me. It was a long hug. Not the quick embrace people give because they think they're supposed to. For a moment, I felt the little boy I remembered, the child who used to run down the dock without looking back. The teenager who once called me from a friend's house because he had forgotten his keys. The young man who had left home believing he understood the world. And now the adult standing in front of me, finally beginning to understand that choices have consequences. When he released me, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Some things don't need to be explained. That afternoon, I walked down to the water alone. The dock was rough beneath my shoes. I ran my fingers across the railing. My husband had built it for the future. At the time, I don't think either of us understood what that meant. He had simply wanted something solid. Something that would remain after the summer ended, after the children grew up, after life changed, after he was gone. I sat at the end of the dock. The water was dark beneath the gray sky. I thought about everything that had happened. The humiliation, the missing documents, the stolen watch, the legal papers, the arguments, the apology, the boundaries, the quiet. It had all happened in a matter of weeks. Yet somehow, I felt as though I had lived through several years. I had learned something uncomfortable. Sometimes the people closest to you know exactly which doors you will leave unlocked. They know which excuses you will accept. They know how badly you want to avoid conflict. And sometimes, without even realizing it, you teach them how far they can go. I had taught my family that I would tolerate too much because I valued peace. Now they knew something different. I valued peace enough to protect it. That evening, I placed my father's letter, the property documents, and the estate records into my fireproof box. The box was locked, the key was with me. My husband's watch sat safely inside its cedar case. Everything important was finally where it belonged. I stood in the center of the room and looked around. The house felt different, not because the walls had changed, because I had. I returned to the lake house for the long weekend in October, just as I had originally planned months earlier. This time, I came alone. There were no unexpected vehicles waiting on the lawn, no voices behind the screen door. No strangers occupying the rooms. The house was exactly as I had left it years ago, except for the small changes I had made since everything happened. The new shed latch, the lockbox beneath the porch, the repaired furniture. The cedar box sitting safely in my bedroom. I carried my bags inside and placed them beside the bed. For a few minutes, I simply stood there. I thought about the first time I had walked into that room after discovering the missing envelope. I remembered the empty drawer, the displaced belongings, the feeling that something familiar had suddenly become unsafe. Now the same room felt peaceful again, not because I had forgotten what happened, because I had stopped being afraid of it. I made tea and carried the cup outside. The afternoon light was turning golden across the lake. I walked down the dock and sat at the very end. The water was nearly still. Across the lake, the trees had changed completely. Red, gold, orange, and brown covered the shoreline. For years, I had thought of this place as something my husband had left behind. Now I understood that wasn't quite right. He hadn't left me the house. We had built it together. He had built the dock. I had maintained it. We had filled the rooms with holidays, arguments, birthdays, Christmas mornings, summer evenings, and ordinary days that seemed unimportant until they became memories. The house belonged to me. But more than that, it belonged to the life we had created. I thought about Julian. Our relationship wasn't magically repaired. I didn't expect it to be. Trust doesn't return because someone says sorry. It returns slowly, through consistency. Through choices, through time. Julian had begun making those choices. He called. He visited. He listened. He stopped assuming that my boundaries were negotiable. That was enough for now. As for Sabrina, I had stopped waiting for an apology. Perhaps one would come someday. Perhaps it wouldn't. Either way, I had reached a place where I didn't need one to move forward. That was another lesson I hadn't expected to learn. Sometimes closure doesn't come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes you create it yourself. The missing envelope was safely stored in my fireproof box. The documents had been protected. My husband's watch had been returned. The house was mine, the dock was standing, and I was still here. I looked across the water. A loon surfaced several yards away. It floated quietly for a moment before disappearing beneath the surface. My husband had always loved their calls. He used to insist that every loon sounded different. I smiled. I still wasn't sure he had been right, but I understood why he loved them. Their calls carried across the water without demanding anything in return. I sat there until the sun disappeared. Then the loon called. One long, wavering sound traveled across the lake. The echo came back from the opposite shore. Then everything became quiet again. I thought about the weekend that had started all of this. I had driven to the lake house expecting 3 peaceful days. Instead, I had found strangers in my home, been humiliated by my daughter-in-law, discovered that my belongings had been searched, and learned that my own son had been too afraid of conflict to defend me. For a while, I thought that weekend had taken something from me. Maybe it had. It had taken my assumption that family automatically meant safety. It had taken my belief that keeping everyone happy was worth almost any personal cost. But it had also given something back: clarity. I finally understood the difference between peace and avoidance. Avoidance says, don't make trouble. Peace says, know what matters and protect it. For years, I had confused the two. Not anymore. I finished my tea and stood. The air had grown cold. Before going inside, I looked once more at the lake. The dock stretched behind me toward the house, solid and weathered beneath the moonlight. My husband had built it because he wanted something that would last. He had succeeded, not perfectly. Nothing lasts perfectly. Boards rot, paint fades, hardware rusts, people change. Families break and sometimes rebuild. Life rearranges everything. But some things can be repaired if you are willing to recognize the damage and do the work. I locked the door behind me. Inside, the house was warm and quiet. I placed my husband's watch on the nightstand. Then I turned off the lights. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something bad to happen. I felt finished. Not finished with my family. Not finished with life. Finished with the idea that I had to surrender my dignity to keep other people comfortable. I had paid for this peace with difficult conversations, uncomfortable decisions, and the loss of an illusion I had carried for years. But the peace was mine now, chosen, protected, real, and as I lay in the dark listening to the wind move through the trees, I realized something simple. There is a difference between being alone and being abandoned. I was alone that night, but I was not abandoned. I had myself, I had my memories, I had the house, I had the dock, I had the lake, and, perhaps most importantly, I had finally learned that protecting my own peace wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Outside, the water moved gently against the shore. And for the first time since that terrible September morning, I slept without wondering who might walk through my door.